This story begins with a somewhat tired boy, who is the main character. It turns out that his tiredness is due to the fact that he had finished agricultural work for a man, who, after receiving the completed work, comes over to where he is thanking him and telling him that he has done enough for them and that he can take a break. In addition to this, the villager offers him money as a reward for the work he did, but the protagonist refuses to accept said donation, emphasizing that his philosophy is not to charge for a good work. After this, the people who are appreciating the moment begin to say that they wish there were more boys in the world like him, and in that the protagonist becomes very happy, since he managed to complete the mission of collecting points for good reputation. After that, the protagonist gives us a brief explanation of what is happening. And it is that it is a game called Divine Catastrophe which, just a week after its world premiere, has reached the goal of 1 billion players, thanks to its realistic graphics and the classes that you can handle within the game. Game, where you can be an adventurer, a magician and even a knight, which has been without a doubt, the spearhead of its success. Following this explanation, the table of the protagonist's statistics is shown and there you can see his name which is Wildrife and that due to his time in the game he is barely at level 1, he also has no profession and his reputation as a player is 9. Then the protagonist explains that to earn a profession he must have a reputation of 10 and in this way he could become a holy knight. Later, the protagonist is walking, and there in the middle of the road he manages to see an old man, who asks him for help to take a ring to the city. Hearing this, the protagonist thinks that this mission will be quite easy to complete since the city is quite close. At that moment, the old gentleman catches the protagonist off guard and throws the ring at him, and when he tries to catch it, his body undergoes such a radical change that he manages to look like another person, and when he turns to talk to the old man, he realizes that this one is gone. In addition to this, his statistics table appears again, but this time he is level 1, with a tyrant profession and his reputation as a player is -100. Seeing this, the protagonist is very surprised and in that the old man appears again and he tells him that he is now part of the tyrant's clan and that now that they are on the same side, he will give him some advice. The protagonist at this point is very angry with the old man and claims him for having turned him into a tyrant, and when asked why he did that, the old man replies that the protagonist had told him that he could complete any mission, and that he would. I'm surprised he's angry. The protagonist replies to the old man that he had been doing missions to get points for good behavior and thus become a holy knight, but thanks to the old man's actions now his dream had collapsed. The old man tells him that all is not lost, and that this may be his chance. Also in the not too distant future, the protagonist will be able to discover the true strength and abilities of a tyrant. The protagonist is not entirely convinced with this clarification from the old man, and the old man tells him that from now on the protagonist will be his disciple and that he will not treat him badly, and while the protagonist laments in his mind for his lost goodness points, the old man tells him that despite the fact that many of his powers are restricted, he will leave him a gift and immediately leaves the place, leaving the protagonist extremely angry and disappointed. After this, the protagonist decides to check his skill table to see what his new profession gives him, but it doesn't show him anything, which makes the protagonist leave the place regretting having offered to help that old man who simply deceived him and made him lose everything. The protagonist decides to return to the city to investigate if there is a way to change his profession, and when he arrives there he says that there will be a great war in the game, where players will be able to get great rewards for each achievement achieved, and also will get a lots of reputation. The protagonist thinks that this is his moment and that he will take advantage of this event to reverse his -100 reputation. However, when he is about to enter the city, a guard stops him because he recognizes that he is a tyrant and threatens to attack him if he does. Follow up. The protagonist stops surprised by what has just happened and trying to say not to worry about him since he is not a bad person, he is immediately surrounded by a large number of guards. Immediately afterwards, the protagonist flees from the place, but they begin to chase him and in the middle of the chase, the protagonist blames the old man, but while he desperately flees, the game system appears and asks him if he wants to activate his abilities as a villain. The protagonist is entertained and at that moment trips and falls to the ground where he later ends up surrounded by all the guards. The protagonist has no choice but to activate the skill tree and in doing so, a strange light begins to come out of his arm. At that moment, one of the seasoned guards decides to attack the protagonist who, without thinking about it, defends himself and ends up making a big cut to the guard. After this, the system appears and there it tells him that his level of sympathy with the people is dropped for attacking a guard. In addition, from now on they offer a bounty on his head which is 10 gold coins. At that moment, the protagonist tries to apologize to the guards, but they begin to attack him mercilessly, but it turns out that the protagonist, without knowing how, begins to evade all the attacks, and at that moment the captain of the guards arrives, so that the main character says that now he is already lost. However, after the captain attacks the protagonist and he repels the attack without taking any damage, something that really surprises him, his expression changes completely, and after saying that it is his turn, he begins to perform a series of ultra-fast movements, each guard falling in the process while the protagonist apologizes to them. After a moment, the protagonist finishes off the guards including his captain, and in doing so he checks his status table, and as he supposed, his ability increased a lot thanks to the fact that his reputation plummeted because of the guards. Then the protagonist says that thanks to that ability that he now has activated he will not be able to enter the city, so he decides to go back and go to a city called the City of Chaos. After that we see some subjects who arrive at the place where the protagonist had just faced the guards, and he asks what had happened. A subordinate informs him that they had been the victims of an adventurer's attack, something that astonishes the mysterious man who could not believe that an adventurer had such a level. Then, the leader of this company yells at his subordinates and orders them to put a bounty on the head of the protagonist, in the amount of 200 gold coins, and that he wanted him alive or dead. On the other hand, the protagonist goes to the City of Chaos, and on the way the system informs him that they have just placed a capture reward against him, and he with great regret says that he wanted to change his job from a Templar Knight to a Holy Knight, but that he ended up being a tyrant because of an old man and now has a reputation of -300. Despite his complaint, the protagonist admits that his villain ability lasts a few minutes, but that he must wait almost an hour to use it again. He then starts looking for some food because the battle left him really hungry, saying that this game is very realistic. In that, he meets a person who tells him that maybe he can find food and water in a small nearby village. After that, we see the protagonist who is in the villa. However, he is surrounded and people tell him not to come near, and the protagonist replies that they have misjudged him and that he does not want to harm anyone, but the people do not believe him and run out of the place. After this unpleasant experience, we see the protagonist who is walking through the village, and he says that if he does not find food he will die of hunger, and that is where food is found, because due to the fleeing of the villagers due to his presence the food was left there, but he wonders if it's okay to take his things. But since he could no longer stand the hunger, he took the food, and in that the system appears telling him that he is stealing food from Los Aldinos, and because of that he received -1 reputation and 10 silver coins. After the protagonist finished eating, he planned to leave the place, but decided to change his outfit. In this way he is left with some clothes, and the system appears again telling him that he had kept another object and that his statistic has negatively increased. After the main character left this place, the villagers return, and upon checking they are surprised that only the main character has been left with a little clothing and food, as well as a letter that the main character had left saying that he was very hungry and thirsty, so he apologizes for taking some of his things, but he will surely return them and pay later. Later, we see the protagonist who after a while manages to reach the City of Chaos, and he decides to enter. Once inside he is surprised because no one recognizes him. However, after a moment he no longer gives importance to this and decides to go to a small tavern in the city, and the owner of the place asks the protagonist what he wants, and he answers that he give him 20 servings of milk and 20 servings of bread since he only wants food and that it be for a long trip. The owner of the place replies that this place is not for children, and that the only thing he can offer him is adult drinks, and after that comment, all the people in the place begin to laugh at the protagonist. However, he just ignores him. And he replies to the owner of the place that he does not want that type of drink, and the owner of the place, which from now on we are going to call Juan, replies that he respects his decision, but that things are very expensive there. At that moment, the protagonist replies that he killed some wild monsters along the way and that he now has 50 silver coins. He asks if there isn't something on the menu that he can buy at that price. Juan replies that for 20 servings of milk and 20 servings of bread and food in total would be 4 gold coins, and if you can afford it. In that, the protagonist goes to the mission table, since apparently this tavern is like a guild in which you can do missions for great rewards, and after this, Juan tells the protagonist that this is not a place where he can be, and that the best thing is that he should go home, and in that a person from the place says that the protagonist must be very scared when he realizes that all the missions are about very powerful monsters. However, the protagonist ignores him and chooses a mission and tells Juan where he can get the reward after completing it. Juan asks the protagonist if he is sure that he wants to kill a beast called Casca. By doing that, all the people when hearing this begin to laugh at the protagonist, saying that he is crazy. Juan tells the protagonist that he can earn a lot of money if he completes that mission. However, he reminds him that this is the most powerful in the place, but the protagonist tells him that he understands and to wait for his return by leaving the tavern. After that, we see the protagonist who was looking for the beast and he thinks that he is lost, but that the mission description said that the beast must be in that place. However, he can't find it anywhere and the protagonist sits down to rest, saying that after having walked so much, he's hungry again and that this game is a bit annoying because it feels very realistic. After complaining for a while, he decides to eat a little and recover energy to continue looking for the beast. After a while, the protagonist finishes eating and decides to leave the place. However, just at that moment a strong tremor is felt and he quickly puts himself on guard, wondering if perhaps it is a beast, but he cannot see any of them for all the place. At that moment, a crack in the ground opens and a small beast comes out, leaving the protagonist very disappointed. However, the small beast ends up becoming the monster that the protagonist was looking for and he prepares for the fight, saying that if the monster came towards him and the monster quickly attacks the protagonist, but he dodges it and then attacks the protagonist, smashing him to the ground, but the protagonist gets up as if nothing had happened and quickly attacks the beast with a series of very fast movements with which he ends up killing the beast, and the system gives him the valuables of his enemy, which are of epic and rare quality, something that leaves the protagonist a little confused. At this point, the system explains how the items in the game are classified, and these are made up of a series of ranks that go from the lowest to the highest, and are also named from ordinary, common, rare, epic, legendary, and mythical. After this we see the protagonist reviewing his new article and he says that what he got from the monster is all level 25 and that when he entered the game he was barely level 13, and at that moment, the protagonist's statistics are shown, which are all above level 20. In that, the protagonist decides to leave the place, so he tries to take the body of the monster. However, no matter how hard he tries, he cannot move the monster, so he gives up and decides to leave the place. After that, we see the protagonist back to the tavern and he tells Juan that he finished off the monster, leaving all the people very astonished. However, they say that the protagonist must be crazy because a child like him couldn't having finished off that monster, and one of the subjects gets up from his chair and approaches the protagonist, telling him that the most likely thing is that he was hanging around all day and then come back and say that he finished off Casca. However, the protagonist just ignores him and asks Juan if he can claim his reward, and this leaves the guy named Henry very upset. Juan tells him to calm down, that he handled this, and Henry ends up walking away. There Juan tells the protagonist that, if he really killed Casca, where is his body, and that, if he does not know that the meat of a Casca is the tastiest in the world, however, he will not pay if he does not show the remains of the monster. At that moment, the protagonist replies that he doesn't know how big that thing is and that he couldn't carry it, so he had to leave it outside the city, and that he has evidence. However, Juan gets upset, telling him that it's enough and that how dare you play with him. The people around begin to say that the protagonist has just made Juan angry, that he doesn't know who he is and that he is a guy who has a reward of 100 gold coins, but the protagonist does not care about that, and Juan says that he hasn't done that for a long time, but that he will have to teach him a lesson. Casca, and that he is out of town and that if he wants he can take him there to check the evidence, but that, nevertheless, he has to pay him, and Juan laughs, telling him that, if anything is threatening, and quickly attacks the protagonist, but he easily dodges it. Juan says that he only has a little bit of speed, but that he won't be able to dodge his next attack. The protagonist is with his sword, saying that it seems that he won't give him his reward until he teaches him a lesson. Without Juan noticing, the protagonist had already made a small cut, telling him, in addition, that he is not going to take his life, but that if he does not pay him, he will send him to the hospital. The people of the place say that it seems that Juan is not capable of defeating the protagonist, and he tells them to shut up and leave the place. After this, he quickly attacks the protagonist, but he can't do anything to the protagonist, something that leaves him very surprised, since he used his 30% and couldn't scratch him. In this way, he charges all his energy using all his power, thus launching a strong attack at the protagonist, which causes a great explosion. However, this attack could only take 2% of the protagonist's life, and he says that enough of the games, and he begins to hit Juan with a series of attacks until he asks him to stop, that he will give him the money. After that, the protagonist begins to count the money while Juan asks the protagonist if that is enough. However, the protagonist tells him that there is still money missing and he is very scared. He runs to see if he has any money left, but he had already given everything he had to the protagonist, but he reminds him that he had asked for 20 servings of milk and 20 servings of food. In this way, the innkeeper decides to go quickly to look for her, and we see the people of the place say that Juan is strong, but that the main character is much stronger and that they hope that he will not take revenge against them for what they told him. At that moment, we see Juan who had already brought him everything that the protagonist had asked for, so the protagonist decides to leave the place and the people are somewhat relieved by his departure. However, at that moment he returns telling him that the remains of the Casca monster is outside the city and that they can go look for it, and this time Juan says that he does believe him. However, at this moment this girl appears and asks what the problem is and why the tavern is closed so early, and one of the subjects approaches the girl, whose name is Vicky, and tells her that if she wants to scare him off since they thought he was the main character who had returned again. The girl replies that she only came to deliver the latest reports of her missions and that there is a boy who looks weak but, nevertheless, has a reward of 200 gold coins, and we see Juan, who is surprised after hearing what he said. What the girl said, saying that the best thing would be for her to move out of the place. And now, what do you think happens in this story? Will the protagonist be able to restore his levels and become a holy knight, or will he continue to increase his tyrant level? We will see that in a second part. Leave a good like to bring more epic content. See you in a next video.